I'm going to start with this conversation with my sort of collaborator on many things, Bob Pianta and Louise Hemmeter, in a conversation, and we'll make sure to leave time also to let you all engage in the dialogue and have some questions towards the end. Because we have a limited amount of time, I'm not going to read bios for them, which I think they're thankful for. I could take up the whole hour if I read about all the accomplishments of these two wonderful people. But they share many things. Some of them you may know, some of them you may not know. So obviously they're both esteemed professors and researchers in the field, Mary Louise here at Vanderbilt, Bob at UVA. They've focused their work on the core work, I think, of most of us in this room, of what's happening in classrooms that really promotes positive outcomes for children, with a primary focus on young children. They're both PIs. They both lead many research projects. Mary Louise was just telling me at breakfast that she's leading so many she may not be able to count them. Hard to keep track of it all. They've both developed coaching models that are being scaled. So obviously Bob, the sort of mind behind MTP and much of the work that's happened around class. And Mary Louise is really the sort of brainchild of the practice-based coaching work that we worked on with her and some other colleagues as a part of the National Center for Quality Teaching and Learning. Observational tools, you know of class, many of you, raise your hand if you use the teapot in your work. So many people, that's an observational measure that really focuses on a set of practices related to supporting children with challenging behavior that Mary Louise was a big part of. And then I'll share one last thing that you may not know that's in common between them. They both each started their careers as teachers, but not just any teachers, teachers in special education settings. And I think that says something about the approach that they've taken to this work that we'll get to. All right, so let's get started. I want to just, because we're focused today on teachers and teaching, I wanted to take a moment just to ground us in the classroom. So could you each just say a few words about when you walk into a classroom and you know that that is a classroom where children who may be struggling with quite severe challenging behaviors are going to be thriving. What are the things that you see? Mary Louise, I'll start with you.
All right, well, thank you. Thank you all for being here, and thank you guys for including me. I'll have to say that, before I respond to your question,
yes.
that if I think back over the last 20 years, what's had the single greatest impact on the quality in early childhood, it's certainly your all's work in the class. And so I'm both glad to be here, but also I'm very grateful that y'all asked me to be here today. So. Anyway, so what would you see in a classroom? So I think one of the things that probably we all have in common is a long-standing commitment to really understanding what's going on in classrooms and not to get too far away from knowing what's happening in classrooms. And so I don't spend as much time in classrooms as I'd like to, but I still get out to classrooms as much as I can because I think it makes the work we do just so much more authentic. So what would I see if I went in a classroom where kids were really thriving? I would see children engaged in meaningful interactions. I would see children who seemed to know the routines of the classrooms. I'd see teachers engaging in conversations with children. I'd see children engaged in meaningful interactions with their peers. And what would I see teachers doing? I'd see teachers supporting children through the use of consistent and predictable routines. I'd see teachers individualizing their support to children, I'd see children getting the level of support they need to be successful in the classroom. I'd see social emotional language being used. But I think the big thing for me around classrooms is I want to go in a classroom and know that that classroom's for all children. And I think my work, because I started out in special ed, has always been about how do we make sure all children are included. And I think initially that was about children who have disabilities, but over time it's really become about children who have social emotional needs and challenging behaviors who may or may not qualify for special education services. And so what I really want to see in classrooms is that teachers are doing what they need to do to be sure that all children can be successful in those classrooms.
That's great. I imagine as Mary Louise is talking, we can all imagine classrooms like that we've seen. So Bob, what would you add? And maybe you could also talk about what you wouldn't see.
Yeah, I have what I'd see and what I wouldn't see. So I think the first thing I would see would be all sorts of evidence of various forms that teacher knows those children personally and individually, and that knowledge gets expressed as she or he is engaging them in any number of the kind of activities, whether it's kind of, circle time, or whether it's a science lesson, or whatever the case may be. That, to Mary Louise's point, that knowledge is distributed across all of the children and expressed in ways that the timing, this is the thing that I'm always struck by. This is the context in which the teacher is like this orchestra conductor, and the timing of how they're able to just exquisitely and sensitively know just when that child is right on the edge or approaching the edge, and can approach them with just the right level of support. Not too much, but just enough, and in the support that's the right form, which might be a word, it might just be my physical presence next to you, it might be a tone of voice, it might be a cue that helps you get distracted from what you're thinking about and return to something else. So I think you just see abundant evidence of that in a lot of different layers. A lot of vigilance, a lot of attention, and it's done smoothly. I think some of the things you don't see or hear, you don't hear the teacher talking a lot. They're not the person who's creating most of the words. And when the teacher does express words, they're clear, and they convey a set of expectations and standards when those do have to be expressed, that kids can understand very, very clearly. Some of the things, this is kind of me personally, but some of the things that I think I don't see or hear in those cases, look, I don't see or hear, or would prefer not to see or hear, the teacher say, I need you to do this right now, which confuses kids. Or you have a choice to do what you're, and to think about a child who may be sort of aroused, in certain ways, and maybe heading toward, is feeling somewhat uncertain themselves, which is why they're misbehaving, and to say, well, you have a choice right now, so you don't see these kind of efforts by the teacher that kind of can create escalation in a child's sense of confusion or being upset. And then, again, as ML mentioned, the kids are busy. They're doing things that are meaningful, that are enjoyable, they're at work, and they feel good about being at the work that they're doing.
Perfect. All right. So
can I just add one thing, which is, as Bob was talking, I was thinking about, and I don't want to get us off on a tangent, but thinking a little bit about the work that's going on now around kind of inappropriate discipline practices. And I think one thing we have to be vigilant about is whether the things that Bob just talked about in terms of good things are happening for all children in a classroom. And I think sometimes those children who push our buttons or who teachers are talking that way to, they aren't spending time talking to children in really positive, supportive ways. And I think that's a challenge for us from a measurement perspective, which is we both have tools that measure whether teachers are doing these things, but it doesn't say, does every child in the classroom get this? And I sometimes worry that some of those really good supportive practices aren't getting to the children that we're most concerned about.
Yeah, and I think of some of the work we're doing right now in some research studies where, I feel like we can capture pretty well the sort of aggregate overall teacher behavior, but I'm not sure we're doing the job that we might need to be doing, which is honestly why when people say to me, what scale, or what dimension on the emotional support side of things would you pay attention? It would be sensitivity, because it's precisely trying to capture that.
Well, and I think, and we'll talk about this, I think one of the things that happens, at least I know in our professional development work, and I'm curious about whether you all experience this, is even if we're talking to a teacher, say we're coaching them using MTP about a generalized practice, most of the times the conversations get down to that level of the child, because it's what's driving them. It's the thing that they want the most help in, is how to support this particular child. So that's where I do feel like we get to it, but I agree with you that we're missing something at the measurement level.
Well, just to go off on it, I'm thinking more and more, and I think this is the evidence we're seeing in some of the work we're doing. Again, I don't know, Emma, if this is your case too, but the coaching work that actually drives teachers into a very fine-grained analysis of their interactions with an individual child very often, that's the moment of learning that actually pulls things together for teachers, where it's like, oh, I get it, interactions do matter, this behavior does matter, I can see the consequences of this on kids that transfer to their behaviors with other kids as well. And so I think this attention to individual kids, particularly when there's some struggle involved between the teacher and the child, can be an extraordinary learning moment for the teacher that has benefits to everyone.
All right, so we've already started talking. No, that's great. Of course, I'm going to follow the lead and go with the flow of the conversation. Yeah. So we've already started talking about intervention, but I would love just to hear your stories of how you came to the approach, especially on the improvement side of the work, because I think those stories can help. Sometimes so another thing you guys have in common is that you haven't just sort of sat in your labs at your universities and done things. You've really been working out at scale in the world. And I think sometimes when we're disseminating things at scale, it just becomes the thing. And what's important is that people doing the thing understand the reasons behind it. So I'm hoping we can get a little bit to that. So Bob, maybe starting with you, as you think about how you sort of move from observing classrooms to really trying to recreate these experiences that you just described for as many children as possible, just tell me a little bit about that journey. And I know that's a very long journey, because I've sat with you for a lot of it, although not all of it. So
we'll try to do this in 5 minutes or less. It actually does connect back to my experience as a special ed teacher. So I had this incredible opportunity as a middle school special education teacher to work with essentially the same group of boys that none of the teachers wanted to work with. The regular teachers wanted to work with for 3 years. Okay, so I had these students with me, for 3 years, and my second year, all of a sudden I was like, wait a minute, like the problems that I had the first year, I don't now have in the second year, and something happened here. Some shift happened, and I began thinking about relationships that I was having with these kids, as a result. And I was aware of how personally we were connected, and how that was really creating a sense of support for them and for me in the school. And these were guys who could be as disruptive as anybody in a middle school could be, and I wasn't having any problems with them. Why is that? Was really the kind of question. So I'll try to fast forward here on the personal journey, but going to graduate school, I coded videotapes of parent-child interaction for many years, and began to understand some of the theory and tools that could be used to kind of capture what I was thinking was my experience in as a teacher, and thought, how do we transfer this to the classroom in ways that are meaningful for teachers? And so that was kind of moving forward, and I was really struck by the way in which, particularly for kids that are having some sort of challenging experience in a classroom, the way in which you could begin to describe and codify how interactions and relationships with the adults were kind of this platform for that child's adjustment and learning in the classroom. It created a very real structure that enabled them to feel a sense of predictability, to be motivated to engage, and to understand. Again, think about kids that are prone to some level of kind of disruption and dysregulation. That's essential for that environment to be an environment that is supportive to them. So we built the class as a way to assess that, and early in the development of that, I had the incredible opportunity to spend a day a week with the teachers in the local pre-K program. We just hung out for an afternoon together. And I just was able to listen to them and try to provide, this was like the beginning of something related to coaching. And I think most of what I did was listen. But what was striking there, and we were beginning to pilot class there, was these teachers were interested in what it was that we were observing, and so we shared the manual with them, and they said, oh, you're describing what it is that I do in the classroom, and this is important to me as kind of a target. And so I began to think like, okay, this can be a target for intervention. And so I think the genesis then of my teaching partner was like, okay, how do you begin to put together a map of the classroom on the features that are salient to relationships and interactions? So how do you describe that and describe the ways in which these interactions support kids' development? It was I still think about the class as a hypothesis about what matters in classrooms. And then to build a system that can enable teachers to enter a space where they can analyze themselves with respect to those behaviors, where they can understand the language and the lexicon that those behaviors describe. Because fundamentally, and this goes back to attachment theory, that is one of the sort of foundations for all this, is that I think what we're trying to do, we all regulate ourselves in relationships with this kind of thing we call an internal working model. What's the constellation of beliefs and perceptions about myself and about other people that guide my behaviors with them? And we needed to create a way to enter teachers' internal working models and help them understand the importance of interactions, and to do that in a way that's kind of safe and objective. And so my teaching partner was really a way to say, can you do this? Can you do this over the internet in a way that might be efficient? And I think we just got lucky to some degree by biasing what we were doing, or designing what we were doing in a way that kind of said, one of the bigger problems that teachers have in trying to understand and operate in the space of interactions is there's so much information. If I said, let's look at your classroom, let's sit down and watch a videotape of 20, of you teaching 15 kids, what do you even focus on in those 5 minutes or those 15 minutes of videotape? There's a zillion data points. And so my teaching partner was really designed around saying, okay, we're just going to look at, your behaviors related to sensitivity, and we're only going to look at them in 30-second clips, and we're going to tell you what we see in this particular clip that you're doing well, because it's really important that you understand and can see what you're doing well. That helps open up, the opportunity. And then let's talk a little bit more about when it may not be going so well. So I think the real strength of that was to think about teachers' attention and the economy of teachers' attention, and say, we've got to really pare this down if we want to actually engage teachers at a level of precision and explicitness in their thinking and experience of relationships that was ultimately going to matter. It's worked. I feel extraordinarily confident that at any given time we could coach teachers from pre-K to high school, and their interactions are improved. And we're just, some plug here, we're just coming out with this very cool study that actually shows that there are two paths through which my teaching partner has effects on teachers' interactions. One of those paths is that teachers actually learn the language and the lens, and they begin to learn the words, and they begin to develop observation skills. And the other path is that they feel supported by the coach. And so the fact that we were able to kind of, compose something that had those components, I think was the way it was successful. But that traced back to being a teacher.
That's great. And
Sorry,
so I want to hear from Mary
answer.
Louise, but and I think we'll come back to the scale piece, because I think that was perfect, because it sort of is the seed of the idea, and then we can talk about how that idea has been influenced as you've scaled it. But one just thing that, the robustness of this approach is I'm always reminded of, and most recently we actually had a colleague here who's from Germany. He was in the office all last week, and he actually uses MTP with coaches, elite coaches of gymnasts in Germany.
Oh, wow.
So he coaches them, and I asked him this again, and I've talked to him many times, but I asked him this again last week, like, have you had to modify the process at all? And he's like, no, not really. I videotape the coaches in their interactions with these elite gymnasts. These are people who are training to be in the Olympics in Germany, and he doesn't focus. He only focuses on feedback from instructional support. So he focuses mostly on emotional support and classroom organization. But he's like, it completely translates to that context, which I think speaks to the fact that it really is just about our interactions with each other that can transcend. That said, we're not coming out with some big sporting intervention anytime soon, but although people have asked. So Mary Louise, tell me your story.
So I just want to say in response to that, what we've done around coaching, all of us, is really based on what we know adults need, right? And so it's not altogether surprising that it would be relevant across what you're coaching people to do. So, well, Bob, so I also coded parent-child interactions in graduate school, so there's another overlap. So I'll try to do this quickly. I think for me, it's kind of amazing that when I worked in my first classroom, which was in Auburn, I might say War Eagle, except for I know that y'all just beat us in basketball, but not bitter about that or anything. Anyway, when I first worked in a classroom in Auburn, it was really before inclusion was a big thing, right? And we were trying to do it. And I think as I moved through my early career, I was really interested in how do you teach young kids with disabilities in inclusive settings. And what I was always running into was teachers who said, I don't have time to do this because I'm always dealing with their problem behavior. And so that's how I kind of got interested in the notion of challenging behavior. And about 20 years ago or so, we got funding from Head Start to develop a model around addressing young children's challenging behavior. And the group of us that did that work were really interested more in promotion and prevention than we were in what do you do when a child has a challenging behavior. But we also knew that it was hard to get people bought into a model of promotion and prevention if you didn't have the promise that you would help them with the hardest children, right? And so at that time we developed, based on work we were all doing, a tiered model of behavior supports that's called the pyramid model. And I think we were all doing research around different levels of that tiered model. So it started with relationships and predictable environments and went into targeted teaching around social emotional skills, but also having a process for supporting children who had the most problematic behavior. So we had this model, but we also realized that you can't test a model like that if teachers can't do it, because it's about how they run their classrooms, right? So it's not like a researcher can go in and do it and we can test it. We had to be able to figure out how we could support teachers to do it. And so we were really fortunate that we had both training money, which meant money to go out and help people implement effective practices, at the same time that we had research money to develop protocol for training teachers and coaching teachers and implementing interventions. And so all of that stuff happened at the same time. And what that meant was that as we were developing our coaching model, as we were developing the pyramid model, we were working with teachers. And so it was this kind of continuous feedback system where we'd work on something and use it, and teachers would say, no, that's not working. And we would revise it. And so we really, it was at a time, I think it was probably about 15 years ago, when people were talking a lot about coaching, but no one could really talk about what coaching looked like. They were doing coaching, but they couldn't talk about what they were doing, right? And so over the course of, I don't know, about 5 years or so, we tested this coaching model in a couple of research trials. We were also doing it in our work in TA systems. And I think what we all know collectively is that if you do coaching well and you do it with fidelity and you do it with sufficient dosage, that we can see change in teacher practice. And I think both of our coaching models are really focused on how you change practice. So it's not just about teachers feeling supported, but it's also about changing practice. It's about meeting teachers where they are, and it's about delivering feedback in that context, right? And we weren't afraid to talk about feedback, and I think that was a big change, because I think for a long time people thought you shouldn't give people feedback, but when you do it in the context of a partnership and in the context of helping teachers be reflective, feedback is a really important component of that. So we're at this, so we got to this point where we had tested the pyramid model, we had tested the coaching model, but now the question becomes, how do you get people to do this? And so when we go out and present about our coaching model, and we talk about, we see teachers about 16 times over the course of the year. Program directors are always like, well, that won't work, right? We can't deliver 16 weeks of coaching to every teacher that we have. And so I think we moved from that into this notion of how do you support a program? So not just how do you support a teacher, but how do you support programs to build their own internal capacity to be able to support teachers. And I'm going to just say a little bit about that, because I know we're going to move into scaling up. But one of the important, I think, pieces of information we've learned from that work is, so we've been working with entire programs, child care centers, Head Start programs, elementary schools, to kind of do the pyramid model program-wide. In other words, to do good, positive behavior support practices for all children in a center. And I think one of the things that I'd be interested in y'all in talking a little bit about is how we ensure that that support works in all of our early childhood programs. So I think we've been fairly successful at doing that in Head Start centers and not so successful at doing that in child care centers. And I think we just finished a randomized trial in low-income, low-resource child care centers. And in those centers, it's not about building their capacity, because there aren't people to build their capacity, right? So it's not just, can we get their director to be a good coach, because that director also is the assistant teacher when the teacher's sick, and is the bus driver when the bus driver's not there. And so I do think that we've all landed on things that work, and I worry about how we get those working in all of our early childhood service delivery systems.
It's funny, I was actually thinking that as you were talking, because in some ways I feel like the interventions as you develop them are influenced by the context in which you're working, and that just makes sense, right? So we started MTP in state-funded pre-K programs. We've now done it in a lot of contexts, but it's very hard to do MTP in childcare. In fact, it just doesn't work, because there are people you really started in Head Start, and I feel like the sort of heart of your work in some way is influenced by starting in that context. You know, one of the things that Teachstone has been working on most recently is a CDA program with class specifically for that, because again, rather than trying to take something that we know works in one context and move it to the other, the question is, especially at scale, what is happening in childcare at scale, and could we actually redesign that thing to be more effective, as opposed to thinking about how we suddenly get coaches to be working in childcare, which is at scale is going to be a long time. So that actually leads us very well to this question of scale. And I'm just, you mentioned a few things, but as you think about how you move something from the lab, or even from sort of large practice to scale, and you know, Mary Louise, I heard you say things like dosage and fidelity, adherence, so we care a lot about the quality with which the interventions were developed get deployed, but we also have to do this with thousands and thousands of coaches and people, all, you know, like many of you here. So what have you sort of learned? What changes have you made? What are your reflections? And I think all of us would agree we haven't solved this problem. It's a constant sort of struggle that we all have, but I'm just Bob, maybe starting with you, what are some of your reflections?
Yeah. So I approached that question from a couple different angles. So I have this connection to these interventions as a developer and as a researcher, and a connection in relation to the activities of Teachstone, and a connection to helping teachers be more effective teachers as a dean that that I help shepherd a school of education that has a teacher preparation program. And so it's this latter experience has really given me some thought about this. So I think at the aggregate level, we can get to where we want to go at scale as we iterate in a space that includes what is it that we're actually trying to change, and what do we think, what's our clearest eyed view of the mechanism through which that changes, that can support that change. So if we're trying to change interactions, okay, that's the focus. We might need to make it simpler than 10 different dimensions of interactions on a tool. If we're changing that, if we have some evidence that those interactions can change as a result of focused attention to the adults' skills in being able to see those interactions and label them, well, that I actually think that's the core of the effectiveness of these interventions that we've proven work. Then how do you take that core and thread it into all the different ways that the workforce is trained, credentialed, and supported during the course of their careers, and build incentives in that system around people's engagement in those kinds of activities in ways that they can do them well. So that's a long-winded, but I think currently we are spending enormous amounts of time and attention to try to improve the adults, the practice of adults in classrooms. We're just doing that. Students go through teacher preparation programs. We spend money on professional development. There's coaching all over the place. So the question is, are those activities aligned to a reflective of what we know actually is likely to produce better interactions and better practices for teachers? So I think that's why you mostly, Bridget, developed, we talked about developing a course, and then we talked about moving that course online. And that's why, we simplify things to sort of thread it out through the CDA. That's why way back when we developed My Teaching Partner, we were thinking, well, can you do this thing called coaching over the internet, because no one's ever going to do it if you're having to pay a coach to drive 2 hours from one school to the next. You can actually reduce the cost and make things more efficient if we do it over the net. So it's thinking about those things and then beginning to align them. We're now, I'm very excited about what's taking place around credentialing. And the fact that we're thinking about these things called micro-credentials and badges that might be tied, to teachers' actual participation in a targeted, limited, focused PD experience in which they demonstrate some success in that experience on the basis of some kind of relevant assessment.
And potentially even get paid more.
And potentially get paid more.
Right.
So, I just think we're beginning to move the systems that regulate and influence workforce development are beginning to kind of wake up a little bit, and be very exciting to get those connected to what we've actually learned about helping teachers be effective in the classroom.
So Mary Louise, you can answer this any way that you want, but as Bob was talking, I was thinking, that's a vision of scale that I think you can probably resonate with in part, but then as I think about the work we did together as a part of the National Center for Quality Teaching and Learning, it's also a very human, right? So
yeah.
How do we work with program leaders or state leaders that then work with program leaders who then work with coaches who then work, so I don't know if that's a part of your reflections of scale, but how do we sort of work in that ecosystem of people like those who are sitting in this room and again, manage this question of fidelity and impact and scale?
Well, there's about 10 things I want to
Okay,
say.
great.
So in the spirit of time, I'll try to be brief. But Bob, when you were talking, one thing that I was struck by was I love the way y'all have really been thoughtful about how to integrate this into systems like higher ed and all those. But one thing that struck me while you were talking is this notion of how much PD money is out there that might not be being spent well and might not be what we know has to happen to change practice, and that somehow there's not going to be endless amounts of money. We got to figure out how to use that money in more effective ways. So, Bridget, to your comment, question, I'll just say a couple of things, which is that we have done a lot of work where we've engaged state teams and around implementing pyramid model kind of statewide. And one of the things that does is that kind of forces them to look at all of their PD systems and their QRIS systems and their licensings, all those systems where this kind of information is likely to be able to be embedded in some meaningful way, right? And those state systems have worked with local demonstration programs. But I think that one of the things that has kind of struck me in our work in the last, 5 or 6 years is how idiosyncratic communities are. So we can kind of build these state systems, but doing that in Nashville is really different than doing it in some small town in far eastern Tennessee, right? And that I think to really meet the needs of our communities around young children across all settings, that we need somewhat more of a community perspective. So when I think about childcare and low resource childcare programs, I don't think we're going to meet the needs of the teachers in those programs until communities come together to support them. And where in communities do we have resources that can mental health resources for teachers and kids? Where in communities do we have resources going into some kind of professional development that could be used across systems? I think this notion that we have this kind of splintered early childhood system, where we have public school, pre-K, and even in public schools we have 3 different funding streams, and then we have a Head Start, and then we have childcare, and we have corporate childcare, and we have low-income childcare, and we're never going to get there with all those programs unless we think more collectively at the community level.
I love that. Yeah.
Great point.
I think, as we partnered with various leaders across the country in their use of class, I've learned a lot. And one of the things I feel like I've learned the most, so Jenna Conway, who sort of developed and led the work in Louisiana using class, and we were lucky enough to recruit her to come to Virginia and do the work she's leading there now. Very early on, she said, it has to be local. I can't have this be something that's being done to programs. They need to own it. And she really made a decision that, quite frankly, I told her was crazy at the time, which is sort of the QRIS is built on local observations, because the idea was you can't do that because they won't reliably assess each other and their own programs. There's too much at stake. But the reason why I think, and she did have state audits, so there was a check on reliability, but I think the reason why that decision was so powerful is exactly to your point. It allows it, and I know we have some folks here from both Louisiana and Virginia in the room who can speak to this, but again, it's not class isn't being done to them. At some level it is, but they really get to learn and understand the tool and then can design it in their systems to work for them as they need it. And I think, and I'll talk a little bit more about this afternoon, but I think that we as an organization at Teachstone will be moving more and more into that space where we are enabler of things that are happening at a local level and giving people in the room and across the country the tools that they need to take this contact. I think that the tension is always, and I feel like I can almost see it in your face, Bob, the tension is always, how do we do that in a way that doesn't then just derive back to the ineffective practices that we see. So I think that's a tension that we all have to live in.
Yeah, and I think, I assume at some level we're all sort of Vygotskians at some level, So when we look at classrooms, we look at this combination of support and challenge that, that teachers engage in with kids. And I think as we think about doing work with systems, it's the same kind of thing. You know, the PD that we're doing with teachers has to, excuse me, combine some element of support and challenge so that it's meaningful change that's taking place. And that also just has to be replicated at the system level. So if it's just, excuse me, just a matter of kind of systems doing the thing that's most comfortable with whatever idea that you're showing up with, then I don't think things actually change in a way that's going to cascade in a meaningful way down to down to program. So that's, I think, where the fidelity kind of thing comes in as we look at the scaling up of interventions. It's not necessarily that somebody will take my teaching partner exactly as we developed it at UVA and do it, but they will understand, oh, okay, there's this nugget in here that that drives some level of change into a classroom, and how do we preserve that nugget? And it might be challenging for me as a program director to figure out how to localize that and carry that into my system when it may not be used to doing these kinds of things. So it's just this kind of, and so the point about tension is we should entertain that tension and be comfortable with it and move in that space, because that's the only way that things are going to move along.
So we only have a few minutes. There's a way in which I feel like all of the work that you all have done has sort of moved, I won't say like step by step by step, but it's sort of very linear and very, is there anything that you're doing in your work that you feel like, or that you've seen happening that's like, what's gonna get us to the next thing? Like what could really change the way in which we're doing this work? I don't know if you have any sort of thoughts or ideas about that.
Oh, I have a lot, but I think that probably for me, well, there's a few things, but the one that I would say most relevant to what we've just been talking about is this notion of tiered models of support for adults. So I think that we have been talking about tiered models of supports for kids and meeting children where they are and giving children the support they need to be successful. And yet we've largely studied our coaching models, giving everybody kind of the same dosage, right? Or at least we have. And I think that where we're going is in trying to figure out how do you give teachers different levels of support based on what teachers need. And that's a challenge, because how do you know what they need, and how do you know how much support meets how much need? But we're starting to do some work in that space. But I think what goes with that, and the tension Bob just brought up, that I also want to be sure I have a minute to say something, which is that this notion of fidelity is important. So we've only tested our models at fidelity, right? Mm-hmm. And so right. What can give and how much can it give? And every time I do it and someone says, how can we do that cheaper? I think, well, we know you can do it from a distance, that helps. We know you can do it with some combination of group and individual sessions, that helps. But I don't know how much you can vary the fidelity of what you do and still get.
Well, like, what's the core? Yeah, totally.
All right.
Yeah.
So Bob, and
then I wish I was like 20 years ago in my career, because I just think this is like so exciting to think about. So at one level, there's this kind of work that's actually moving out, and how do you figure out ways to support that and align with credentialing systems and fidelity at large scale supports. And then there's the kind of next generation of sort of basic science that I think is going to enable us to be far more effective in creating distributed models of supports for teachers that they can access anytime, in any place, and that will be effective. And so I think that's largely going to be driven around technology. So I think the kind of things that are happening in artificial intelligence and natural language processing can enable us to post, teachers to have a community where they post videos of themselves that then get a little bit of a processing that says, oh, your interaction in this place seems kind of be tending in this direction. And then that stimulates a conversation among them, so among a group of teachers on the cloud. I think there's a possibility. I am very excited about the possibility. This doesn't need artificial intelligence to create crowdsourced communities of collective observers that, as they engage with video, the back end of the website is being able to identify which one of those observers that is commenting actually looks like a coach in that kind of exchange, and then figure out ways to sort of credential and badge that person as they move up and enhance other people's skills. So I'm completely excited about that, because I think what it's going to do is let the computers and computational methods and technology do the things that right now are like take a lot of time and attention and drive costs up, and that ultimately that enables people to do the things that people are really good at, which is engaging with one another in teams and engaging with kids in classrooms, rather than figuring out how do I upload my videotape and code this thing, for my little community of practice.
We'll have to have a track focused on the next generation next year. In fact, there's some great work happening at UVA and other places across the country right now also around simulation, using simulation so that, as Jason Camrus, who's a superintendent now in Richmond, said, I'm tired of having my teachers practice on my students. And I want an environment in which they can practice and learn to be good teachers, and they need time to do that, but I want them to do it in a space that they feel safe, where they're not worried about the impacts that they're going to be having on their teachers. So I think there's really exciting work.